y'all, it's Stinger, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to make some lush, romantic, elegant, and lustful R&B beats for Lawsy and Texako. To set aside all the intro hoopla, let's just get right to it. Alright, so the first melody that I laid out is using the 3 keyboards patch from Purity, and this is what it sounds like. Alright, when I start out my melodies, I always start out with a bass line just to give a solid foundation. The chord progression I'm using for this bass line is a 6, 1, 5, 4. I also have the chords chopped in certain places, like right here, right here, right here, just to give it a little bit more rhythm. My rule when chopping up the notes is chopping them where I want the 808 and the kick to be hitting. This way the rhythm with the melody and the drums kind of align. After I had that bass line laid out, I threw some chords in octave higher. So let's go ahead and break this down. This first chord that I have is a D sharp 7 and it transitions into a D sharp basic triad. From there it goes to the F sharp, but I removed the 5th because I wanted these top 2 notes to stay the same just to give it a little bit of suspense. After that we go into a C sharp 7 into a C sharp 6. I just liked how the transition between the B and the A sounded, so I didn't keep it as like a basic triad for this one. And then we go into a B7 to a B7 diminished. Diminished chords are completely optional for R&B, but I like the flavor it gave this melody, so I kept it in. An easy way to make diminished chords is just to take the 3rd and 5th of the chord you're working with and move it down 1 semitone. A good way to ensure that the listener isn't very caught off guard by this diminished chord is to put a normal chord before the diminished chord. That way there's a little bit of change. It's not just one chord going into a completely different diminished chord. There's a little bit of correlation between the chords. Now these chords are pretty standard stuff, so I'm going to go into the first counter melody. Here we have our counter melody up here, and this is what the melody sounds like with them. A great starting point when coming up with your counter melodies is to start it on the 5th of the chord you're working with. The 5th is a pretty comfortable note to rely on when it comes to making leads, and from there you can build some really great counter melodies. I like to make my counter melodies have the same kind of rhythm but with different notes. That way there's one sort of constant throughout the whole melody. Also, when making your counter melodies, you don't want them to be too complicated and fill out the whole melody. Be sure to leave some dead space to make room for either the drums or different parts of the melody. Now, since that first counter melody was a little bit repetitive, I added in a second counter melody with some higher notes. And here's what it sounds like. One thing I suggest doing when making your counter melodies is to add a little bit of strumming, especially for beats like this, to give it a more human aspect. To strum your notes, you could either use Alt-S, and that brings up this strumming panel where you can adjust the time, or you could just hold Alt and grab the note you want to strum to move it freely. When it comes to your counter melodies, a great way to build resolution is to take this last note of the counter melody and match it with the first note. And when I say match, I don't mean use the same note, but rather use a note that correlates or transitions well from the last note. So as you can see from here, the last note is B and it's going right into an A sharp. Notes that are one note away from each other in the scale are perfect for building transitions. So if you're ever stuck with that, just go with old reliable. Alright, now that we got the first portion of the melody out of the way, we can move into the next. Here I've got a lead I made in Serum. It's basically just a sine lead with some distortion on it, and I use this to fill in that dead space that we were talking about earlier. And this is what it sounds like. When making this lead, I also took into consideration the rule I used with the counter melodies, being using the 5th of the chord you're working with to build your melodies. So right here, the 5th of the chord that is playing at that moment is C sharp. The 5th is always a great basis to build some leads off of. Some other notes that do the job are the 3rd, the 7th, and sometimes the 4th. Yet again, here we're also playing around with strumming, but instead of the standard strumming sound you get from a piano, this is more or less a glide. This also adds some humanization to your melody and makes it stand out just a little bit more. The next portion of the melody is not so much a melodic component, but rather an ambience. This is the Starlight patch from Purity, and for the effects I have Pancake, which is a free panning automation tool that I use all the time, and I just drew out this custom shape to make it pan hard left and hard right. Next we've got the Agape Warmth patch from Omnisphere. This is just a pretty mellow pad with some really nice harmonics. To get this, I took the chords from the first melody and simplified them a bit. Nothing too much that I really need to go over here. Next, I've got these strings from BBC Symphonic Orchestra, which is a great free orchestral plugin. You do have to wait 30 days, I believe, to get it for free, but if you just want it right away, you just pay $40 or $50 or whatever it is. I say it's well worth the money. Here is what it sounds like. My recommendation when making melodies like this is to start with long notes and then add in transition notes in between. And you can see with these two notes, I'm also playing with the transition aspect of using notes that are one note away from each other in the scale. And the last portion of the melody, being my favorite, is this live bass that I played. Now for this, I didn't actually use a bass guitar. I used an electric guitar and pitched it down 24 semitones. And even if you're a complete beginner, if you have an electric guitar, this is stupid easy. All you do is play the bass note on your MIDI keyboard and find the note on the guitar that matches up with it. From there, you can just build your bass line. This is my first time doing it, and I love it way more than any kind of bass VST, and it's a super rewarding feeling when it comes out like this. For the effects on that, I have Decapitator to give it a little bit more low end. I have FabFilter Saturn to give it some saturation. I have an EQ taking out some of the highs, and another EQ boosting the lows way up. So with all the melodic components together, this is what it sounds like. So now that we've got the melody out of the way, we can go into the fun part, the drums. Usually I start out my drums with the 808, but since I already have a live bass playing, there's really no need for 808, so I just went right into the kicks. This is just a pretty basic kick pattern following the live bass. Next, I have this snare from Shadow's Valentine kit. If you're making any kind of R&B or plug-in beat type stuff, I definitely recommend grabbing that kit. It has a bunch of iconic sounds from the 90s and a bunch of sounds you hear all the time in plug-in beat. So this is what the snare sounds like. Next, I've got that signature 90s R&B perk. You already know the one that I'm talking about. This is what it sounds like. Next, I've got these live drums from SSD Sampler. These notes in red are the hi-hats, and I have them varying in velocity, obviously to make them sound realistic. I also have them cut out when the snare hits, that way there's a little bit more bounce and breathing room for the beat. In the red are the snares, and I have them playing a pretty basic accent snare pattern, but I add in these rolls to make the drums sound more realistic, and let me explain. So for a second, let's pretend my portable charger is a snare, and this mechanical pencil is a drumstick. When hitting a snare, your drumstick can either do this, or this. It's a pretty standard technique when it comes to drums, and people who don't play the drums may not know of that, so that's a great thing to throw into your live drums to give it a little bit more realism. And next, I just have this open hat hitting right before the snare that gets cut off really quickly by the other hi-hat. And the last portion of the drums is this classic wind chime sound. I just have that hitting on the snares at certain points, and nothing really fancy that I need to go over. So this is what the drums and the melody sound like all together. So that's pretty much all I need to cover when it comes to making a Lawsy and Texako R&B type beat. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and learned something new today. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Other than that, that's going to be it. Peace.